Lieutenant Colonel Maya Rodriguez adjusted her baseball cap law as she entered the PAC Convention Center in San Diego. The familiar weight of anonymity settling around her shoulders like a comfortable jacket. The annual Special Operations Symposium buzzed with testosterone and war stories. Exactly the kind of event she usually avoided when off duty. The massive hall riot of coffee, cologne, and that particular brand of military confidence that came from men who'd seen the elephant and lived to tell about it. She'd only agreed to come because her younger brother, Danny, had practically begged her, his eyes lighting up like a kid's when he'd mentioned his SEAL team captain was the keynote speaker. "You have to hear this guy, Maya," Danny had insisted over dinner the night before, his fork gesturing enthusiastically at her across the table. "Captain Morrison is a legend. 3 bronze stars, 2 silver stars, and he's got stories that'll make your hair stand on end." Maya had rolled her eyes, but something in her brother's voice, a mixture of hero worship and genuine respect, had worn down her resistance. Besides, she was curious about the man who'd done such devotion from her notoriously hard-to-impress little brother. Now, threading her way through clusters of broad-shouldered men in tactical pants and polo shirts, Maya felt the familiar sensation of being a ghost in her own world. In her faded jeans, Stanford University sweatshirt, and worn sneakers, she looked like any other civilian attendee, maybe a defense contractor's wife or a journalist covering military affairs. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 15 years fighting to be seen and respected in the cockpit, and now she was actively trying to blend into the background. She found a seat near the emergency exit. Old habits from combat zones died hard and settled. And as the crowd began to quiet, the stage was simple but effective. A large screen displaying the Special Operations Command logo, a podium with the American flag draped behind it, and professional lighting that would make even the most battle-scarred warrior look heroic. Maya pulled out her phone to check messages, half listening to the introduction being delivered by a general whose chest candy could probably fund a small country's defense budget. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Captain Jake Reaper Morrison, United States Navy SEALs." The man who strode onto the stage commanded attention without trying. Average height, but built like a prize fighter. With graying temples that spoke of years under the sun and stress, Captain Morrison moved with the fluid confidence of someone who'd learned to be comfortable in his own skin through trial by fire. His dress blue uniform was immaculate, but Ma's trained eye caught the small details that marked him as the real deal. The way he unconsciously scanned the room's exits, the slight favor he gave his left leg, probably from an old injury, and the calm alertness in his eyes that never quite went away in men who'd spent years in harm's way. For 20 minutes, Morrison held the audience spellbound with stories from Operation Red Wings, his voice painting vivid pictures of chaos, brotherhood, and split-second decisions that meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. Maya found herself leaning forward despite her intention to remain detached. The man was a natural storyteller, weaving technical details with human emotion in a way that made even her, someone who lived through her own share of combat, feel the weight of those moments in the Hindu Kush Mountains. The thing about combat, Morrison was saying, his hands gesturing to emphasize his point, is that it strips away everything that doesn't matter. Your college degree doesn't mean when bullets are flying. Your bank account can't stop an RPG. All that matters is the person next to you and whether you can count on them when everything goes sideways. The audience was hanging on every word, and Maya could see why Danny idolized this man. Then, without warning, Morrison stopped mid-sentence. The transition was so abrupt that Maya looked up from her phone, wondering if there was a technical problem. But the captain was simply standing there, his steel-gray eyes sweeping the crowd of 800 people with the methodical precision of a sniper acquiring targets. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable, then electric with anticipation. I'm going to ask something, Morrison finally said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. And I need complete honesty. He paused again, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. Maya felt a prickle of unease, though she couldn't say why. Something in his tone suggested this wasn't part of his prepared remarks. Any combat pilots in here tonight? The question hung in the air like a challenge. And I mean real combat, not training exercises or ferry flights or showing the flag in some peaceful corner of the world. I'm talking about people who've had bullets flying at them while they're flying. People who've dropped ordnance in anger. People who know what it's like to have someone on the ground screaming for help over the radio while you're trying to thread the needle between saving lives and avoiding a blue-on-blue incident. Maya's stomach clenched as if she just pulled 6 gs. In a tight turn around her, she could feel the crowd's energy shift. People sitting up straighter, looking around with curiosity and anticipation. This wasn't just a rhetorical question. Morrison was building to something. And whatever it was, Maya had the sinking feeling she wasn't going to like where this was headed. Mia's stomach clenched as memories flooded back unbidden, each one hitting her with the force of a missile impact. The screaming radio. Calls from troops in contact echoed in her mind. Voices tight with fear and desperation. Coordinates rattled off between bursts of automatic weapons fire. The controlled panic of forward air controllers trying to paint targets while bullets whined overhead. She could almost smell the jet fuel and cordite. Feel the familiar weight of her helmet and the bite of her harness during hygiene maneuvers. The green tracers arcing up from Taliban positions materialized in her mind's eye like deadly fireworks. Each one a reminder that someone down there was actively trying to kill her. She remembered the first time she'd seen them. Beautiful and terrifying, rising toward her F-16 like angry fireflies in the Afghan night. Her instructor back at Luke Air Force Base had described them in clinical terms during training, but nothing had prepared her for the visceral shock of realizing those pretty lights were 23mm rounds designed to turn her aircraft into a fireball. Maya's hands unconsciously gripped the armrests of her chair as she relived the split-second decisions that meant American soldiers went home alive or in body bags. The weight of those moments had never truly left her. The knowledge that her accuracy, her timing, her willingness to push the envelope could mean the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophe. She'd carried that burden for 89 combat missions, each one adding another layer to the invisible armor she'd built around her. Emotions. Her mind drifted to the night that still haunted her dreams. September 15, 2019. Helmand Province. The mission that had started as routine close air support and devolved into a nightmare of confusion and desperation. She could still hear the forward air controller's voice. Call sign Chaos 6. Breaking with strain as he'd screen coordinates over the radio. Viper, we've got troops in contact. Danger close. I say again, danger close. We need immediate suppression. Griff 41 RQ2 34567 890. The memory was so vivid, she could feel her heart rate spiking just thinking about it. She'd been flying at 15,000 feet, scanning the ground through her targeting pod when the world below had erupted in muzzle flashes and explosions. A SEAL team had been pinned down in the compound, surrounded by what intelligence later estimated was a full company of Taliban fighters, nearly 150 enemy combatants who'd turned a routine raid into a potential massacre. Maya remembered the sick feeling in her stomach when she'd realized how close the friendlies were to the targets she needed to engage. Danger close meant the good guys were within 600 m of where she'd be dropping ordnance. Close enough that a slight miscalculation could turn her from savior to executioner. The rules of engagement were clear. Danger close missions required explicit approval from the ground commander. And even then, the pilot had the right to refuse if the risk was too high. But as she'd watched through her targeting pod, she'd seen the thermal signatures of the SEAL team growing smaller and tighter as they were, forced into an increasingly desperate defensive position. The Taliban fighters were closing in, and she could see secondary explosions from RPGs impacting the compound walls. Time was running out, and she was the only aircraft in the area with the firepower to make a difference. The shrapnel scar on her left temple throbbed as she remembered the Surfaceto-air missile that had nearly ended her career and her life that same night. She'd been so focused on her gun runs, so committed to keeping the enemy's heads down, that she'd almost missed the missile launch signature on her radar warning receiver. The SA-7 had detonated close enough to spiderweb her canopy and send metal fragments through the cockpit, one piece missing her carotid artery by less than an inch. Around her in the convention center, Maya counted maybe a dozen hands going up, all belonging to men with the unmistakable bearing of military aviators. She recognized the tide immediately, the slightly cocky posture that came from mastering one of the world's most demanding professions, the way they held their shoulders, the unconscious habit of scanning the room, even in a safe environment. These were her people, her tribe, the brotherhood of warriors who'd learned to dance with death at 500 knots. The SEAL captain was nodding approvingly at the raised hands, clearly building to some point about air-ground coordination. Maya could see where this was going. Probably a discussion about the critical importance of close air support. Maybe some statistics about how many ground troops owed their lives to fast movers and rotary wing aircraft. It was a familiar narrative, one she'd heard countless times in briefing rooms and after-action reviews. Maya's hand felt like it weighed 000 pounds as she considered raising it. She'd spent 15 years proving herself in a male-dominated field, fighting for every opportunity, every mission, every chance to show that she belonged in the cockpit of a fighter aircraft. Even now, sitting in civilian clothes at a public event, the old instinct to avoid drawing attention, weared with something deeper. The pride of a warrior who'd earned her place in the sky through skill, courage, and an unwavering commitment to the mission. The internal conflict was nothing new. Throughout her career, she'd walked a tightrope between visibility and invisibility, needing to be seen and recognized for her achievements while simultaneously trying not to stand out so much that she became a target for those who questioned whether women belonged in combat roles. It was an exhausting balance, one that her male colleagues never had to consider. "Come on, don't be shy," Captain Morris pressed, his eyes still scanning the crowd with the methodical precision of a hunter. "I know there are more of you out there." His voice carried a note of gentle challenge, the kind of tone that suggested he understood the reluctance some might feel about identifying themselves in such a public form. "This isn't about ego or war stories. What I'm building to here is important, and I need you to trust me on this." Maya felt her brother Danny's elbow nudge her ribs, a gentle but insistent pressure that made her acutely aware of his presence beside her. He knew exactly what she'd done in the Air Force, even if she never talked about it at family dinners or holiday gatherings. Danny had been the one to frame her distinguished flying cross citation and hang it in his apartment. Despite her protest that it was too much attention, he'd been the one to quietly research her missions online, piecing together the sanitized after-action reports that mentioned an unnamed F-16 pilot who provided decisive close air support during various operations. The silence in the convention center stretched like a taut wire, becoming almost physical in its intensity. Maya could hear the subtle sounds that emerged when 800 people tried to remain perfectly still. The whisper of fabric against fabric, the soft creak of chairs, someone's stomach growling 3 rows ahead. The air conditioning system hummed overhead, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the muffled sounds of San Diego traffic through the building's walls. She was acutely aware of the weight of expectation in the room. Captain Morrison wasn't just asking a casual question. He was setting up something significant. And the pilots who'd already identified themselves seemed to sense it, too. Maya could see them shifting slightly in their seats. Some looking around to see if anyone else would step forward. Others maintaining the thousand-why stare that came naturally to people who'd learned to compartmentalize extreme experiences. The internal debate raging in Mia's mind was fierce and immediate. Part of her, the part that had learned to survive and thrive in a profession where being different could be dangerous, screamed at her to remain seated. She'd spent years perfecting the art of being exceptional without being exceptional, of proving her worth without drawing the kind of attention that invited scrutiny, criticism, or worse. The military had taught her that sometimes the best way to serve was to blend in, to let her actions speak louder than her presence. But another part of her, the part that had strapped into an F-16 cockpit 89 times knowing she might not come home, was tired of hiding. Tired of letting other people tell her story, or more often, of having no story told at all. She thought about the young women she'd mentor. Taught her that sometimes the best way to serve was to blend in, to let her actions speak louder than her presence. But another part of her, the part that had strapped into an F-16 cockpit 89 times knowing she might not come home, was tired of hiding. Tired of letting other people tell her story, or more often, of having no story told at all. She thought about the young women she'd mentored over the years, the ones who'd sought her out after hearing whispered rumors about a female fighter pilot who'd actually seen combat. She remembered their faces, hungry for proof that it was possible, that the barriers weren't insurmountable, that someone like them could make it to the sharp end of the spear. Ma's mind flashed to a conversation she'd had with her squadron commander just before her retirement ceremony. Colonel Sarah Torch Williams had been one of the first women to fly combat missions in Iraq, and she'd pulled Maya aside for what she'd called the talk, the one that every successful female military officer eventually had to have with herself. "You know what the hardest part of this job is?" Torch had asked, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "It's not the flying. It's not the combat. It's deciding when to be visible and when to be invisible. When to stand up and be counted, and when to keep your head down and just do the work." Maya had nodded, understanding exactly what her mentor meant. Every woman in a male-dominated field faced the same impossible calculus. Be too quiet and your achievements went unnoticed. Be too loud and you were labeled as attention-seeking or difficult. The sweet spot was narrow and constantly shifting. And the consequences of miscalculating could be career-ending. But here's the thing. Torch had continued, her eyes boring into mass with an intensity that made her sit up straighter. Sometimes you have to choose to be visible not for yourself but for the ones coming behind you. Sometimes you have to stand up and be counted because if you don't, who will? Now, sitting in the convention center with Captain Morrison's challenge hanging in the air, Maya felt the weight of that conversation pressing down on her. She thought about the statistics she knew by heart. How few women had flown combat missions. How many barriers still existed. How many young girls grew up never knowing that someone like them had ever strapped on a fighter aircraft and gone to war. Then, as if controlled by someone else, Maya felt herself rising. The movement was fluid and confident, the same way she'd stood in countless briefing rooms before dangerous missions. The same posture she'd adopted when accepting her commission as a second lieutenant fresh out of the Air Force Academy. There was no hesitation in the motion, no uncertainty. It was the movement of someone who'd made a decision and was prepared to live with the consequences. The effect was immediate and electric. Conversations died mid-sentence as if someone had thrown a switch. Head swiveled toward her with the synchronized precision of a drill team, and Maya could feel the weight of 800 pairs of eyes settling on her like a physical force. A woman near the front actually gasped audibly, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. Maya stood perfectly still, her chin raised slightly in a gesture that was part defiance, part pride, and entirely Authentic. She met Captain Morrison's surprised gaze across the sea of staring faces. Her posture radiating the quiet confidence that came from years of proving herself in situations where failure meant death. The silence was so complete she could hear the air conditioning humming overhead, the distant rumble of traffic outside, and what sounded like someone's sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind her. Doc. Captain Marson's expression shifted from surprise to intense curiosity, his eyebrows raising slightly. As he processed what he was seeing, Maya could practically see the gears turning in his head. The mental recalibration that happened when expectations collided with reality. She'd seen that look before countless times in briefing rooms and ready rooms and operation centers around the world. It was the moment when someone realized their assumptions had been wrong. Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system, each word measured and respectful. The formal address was deliberate. Maya realized a signal to the crowd that this wasn't a moment for casual interaction or surprised commentary. What did you fly? The question hung in the air like ordnance waiting to detonate. Maya felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once preceded every combat mission. The heightened awareness that came when everything was on the line. She could feel Danny's presence beside her, could sense his mixture of pride and anxiety as he waited for her response. Around the auditorium, she was aware of people leaning forward in their seats, cell phones being discreetly raised to capture the moment. Whispered conversations starting and stopping as people tried to process what they were witnessing. F-16 Fighting Falcon, Mia replied, a voice steady and clear, carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak those words. Call sign Viper 99 Combat Stories. Afghanistan 2018 to 2020. The auditorium exploded. Not polite applause or respectful acknowledgement, but genuine shock and excitement that rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Someone in the back shouted, "Holy shit," before catching himself, his voice carrying clearly in the acoustically perfect space. Another voice called out, "No way." From somewhere to Mia's left, followed immediately by a sharp language. From what sounded like a senior NCO, MIA watched the waiver reaction spread through the crowd, faces turning toward neighbors with expressions of amazement. Hands gesturing animatedly as people tried to process what they'd just heard. She could see veterans pulling out phones to Google her call sign, others turning to companions with looks that clearly said, "Did you know about this?" The energy in the room had shifted completely, transforming from polite attention to electric excitement. Captain Morrison's face broke into a wide grin that transformed his entire appearance, erasing years of hard living and replacing them with something approaching boyish enthusiasm. "Viper," he repeated, and Maya saw. Recognition began to dawn in his eyes like sunrise breaking over a mountain range. His expression shifted again. This time to something deeper. A look of concentration as he accessed memories that had been filed away, but never forgotten. "Wait a minute." Morrison said slowly, his voice trailing off as he worked through whatever mental database he was accessing. "Viper. September 15th, 2019. Helmand Province." The words came out with increasing certainty, each one building on the last. "You're the pilot who saved Bravo Team when we were pinned down in that compound." Maya's heart stopped. The convention center, the crowd, the noise, everything faded away as she found herself transported back to that night over Afghanistan. She remembered the mission with crystalline clarity. The desperate radio calls, the danger close gun runs, the gratitude in the ground controller's voice when the enemy fire finally slackened. But she'd never known the names of the men she'd helped save. Never seen their faces or learned their stories. They'd been voices on the radio, thermal signatures on her targeting pod, coordinates on a map. "That was your team?" she asked, her professional composure cracking slightly. For the first time since she'd stood up. The question came out softer than she'd intended, carrying a note of wonder that she couldn't quite suppress. Around them, the crowd had gone silent again. Sensing that something significant was happening, that they were witnessing a moment that transcended the usual boundaries of a military symposium. Morrison nodded slowly, his grin fading into something more serious, more profound. "Bravo team, 3rd Platoon. SEAL Team 5, he confirmed. "We were supposed to be in and out in 20 minutes. Quick hit on a high-value target, grab some intel, and disappear before anyone knew we were there." His voice carried the weight of memory, the particular tone that veterans used when recounting missions that had gone sideways. "Instead, we walked into a hornet's nest," Morrison continued, his eyes never leaving Maya's face. "Someone had tipped them off, and they were waiting for us. We had maybe 30 seconds of surprise before the whole neighborhood lit up like the 4th of July. By the time we realized what was happening, we were surrounded and taking fire from 3 directions." Maya felt a chill run down her spine as she remembered monitoring the radio traffic that night. The way the routine mission chatter had suddenly exploded into chaos. She could still hear the forward air controller's voice. "Call sign Chaos 6" as he tried to coordinate the extraction while bullets snapped overhead. "You came in so low I could see your face through the canopy," Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion that he wasn't trying to hide. "Get up here," Captain Morrison commanded. But his tone was warm with respect and something deeper. The kind of recognition that passed between warriors who'd shared the crucible of combat. "Right now, I mean it." His voice carried the authority of command, but Maya could hear the emotion underneath. The weight of gratitude that had been carried for years without an outlet. As Maya began walking down the aisle, the applause started slowly, then built like an avalanche, gaining momentum. It wasn't the polite, measured clapping of a formal military ceremony, but something raw and genuine that seemed to come from the gut rather than social obligation. People were rising to their feet as she passed, some wiping their eyes, others shaking their heads in amazement. A grizzled master sergeant near the middle aisle reached out to briefly touch her shoulder as she walked by. His weathered face split by a grin that spoke of shared understanding. "That's what a hero looks like," someone called out from the crowd, and Maya felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. She'd never been comfortable with that word, hero. To her, she'd simply been doing her job, executing the mission she'd trained for, living up to the oath she'd taken. But looking at the faces around her, seeing the genuine emotion and respect, she began to understand that sometimes the impact of your actions extended far beyond your own understanding of them. The walk to the stage felt both eternal and instantaneous. Maya was acutely aware of every step, every face in the crowd, every camera phone recording the moment. But she was also transported back to that night over Afghanistan, remembering the weight of responsibility she'd felt as she'd lined up for her first gun run, knowing that men's lives hung in the balance of her accuracy and courage. When she reached the stage, Captain Morrison extended his hand in what started as a formal handshake, but quickly transformed into something more personal. He pulled her into a brief, fierce hug that spoke of brotherhood forged in fire, the kind of bond that existed between people who'd faced death together and emerged on the other side. Maya could feel a strength in his embrace, but also a tremor that suggested this moment was affecting him as deeply as it was affecting her. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison announced, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system as he turned to address the crowd while keeping one hand on Maya's shoulder. "This woman saved my life and the lives of 7 of my teammates. She put her aircraft between us and a company of Taliban fighters. Made gun run so low I could see the determination in her eyes through her helmet visor." The applause thundered through the convention center. But Morrison raised his hand for silence. He wasn't finished, and Maya could see that. He had more to say, something that went beyond the simple recounting of a successful mission. "Let me tell you what really happened that night," Morrison continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a man who told this story. before, but never with the protagonist standing beside him. We were pinned down in a compound that was supposed to be lightly defended. Instead, we found ourselves facing what felt like half the Taliban army. They had us surrounded and they were closing in. Maya remembered the thermal imagery from her targeting pod, the way the enemy fighters had moved with tactical precision, using cover and concealment as they'd attempted to overrun the SEAL position. It had been clear even from 15,000 feet that the situation was desperate. The rules of engagement were clear, Morrison said, his eyes scanning the crowd. Danger close meant she had every right to refuse the mission. The risk of friendly fire was enormous. One miscalculation, one slight error in targeting, and she could have killed the very people she was trying to save. He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over the audience. But Viper didn't hesitate. She came in low and fast, putting 20mm cannon rounds exactly where they needed to go. And when that wasn't enough, when the enemy kept pressing their attack, she came back again and again. For 45 minutes. She was our guardian angel, keeping the wolves at bay until the quick reaction force could reach us. Maya felt tears. Threatening, something that hadn't happened in years. The clinical after-action reports had never captured the human element of that night. The voices on the radio, the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that real people with families and futures were depending on her skill and courage. Just doing my job, Captain, Maya managed, her voice steady despite the emotion she was feeling. It was the standard response, the one that every military professional gave when praised for exceptional performance. But even as she said it, she knew it was both true and inadequate. No, Morrison said firmly, addressing both her and the crowd. You went above and beyond. You took risks that weren't required, made decisions that saved lives, and showed the kind of courage that defines the very best of our military. He turned to face the audience fully. And everyone in this room needs to understand heroism doesn't have a gender. Courage doesn't have a gender. Excellence doesn't have a gender. The standing ovation that followed lasted 5 full minutes. But what Maya remembered most was the young girl in the front row, maybe 12 years old, staring at her with wide, wondering eyes. The girl was sitting next to what was obviously her father, a man in navy dress blues, whose chest displayed the ribbons of multiple deployments. But it was the daughter's expression that captured Maya's attention. A look of amazement and possibility, as if she was seeing her own future take flight. As the applause finally began to die down, Maya caught the girl's eye and smiled, offering a small wave that was returned with enthusiasm that bordered on hero worship.